All right, so our next speaker is Dr. Rahul Gairola. Rahul is the Krishna Summers Senior Lecturer in English and Postcolonial Literature and a Principal Fellow of the Indo-Pacific Research Center in the School of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences at Murdoch University in Western Australia. He has published very widely. He has 6 books to his credit and over 50 articles, and he's delivered invited talks and conference papers around the world. He has taught previously at the Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee in India, and the City University of New York. And he's also an editor for both Routledge and OUP, and currently for the 24-25 academic year, he is research fellow at the, or just this semester, right, Rahul? This semester? Yeah, this semester, yes. He's research fellow at the University of Münster in Germany. So please join me in welcoming Rahul. And I'm going to read the title of your paper. Rahul's paper is called From Partition, Necropolitics to Digital Biopolitics, Reincarnation of Resistance and Online Archival Narratives of the 1947 Partition Archive. Welcome, Rahul.
Great, thank you, everyone. So I'll just dive right in. I'll start with a personal narrative, since this is about death and migration. A couple of weeks ago, I was actually speaking at Oxford and Cambridge, and in between traveling, my bag got stolen. So I'm actually going to be sort of improvising and sharing with you work that comes out of the new book that I'm working on, and this presentation is part of that. That book is called Digital Necropolitics in Queer India: Race, Gender, and Sexuality in Technoscapes of Home. And the contribution, so far we've heard a lot over the past 3 days about narrative, memory, genocide. Mirza talked a lot about the notion of home. And the contribution I want to make is in reference to the notion of digital aesthetics that we just heard in the previous paper. I want to introduce to you the notion of digital forensics. So the way that I see my work is at the intersection of what Akhil Membe calls necropolitics and the notion of digital forensics with respect to the 1947 Partition Archive. And again, with reference to the previous paper about the Marichjhapi massacre, I've been very interested in the massacres that occurred during the partition of what was called British India in August 1947. If you're not too familiar with that, when the British left in August of 1947, they divided India on the western side and the eastern side into the countries that are now known as Pakistan and Bangladesh. During those divisions, which were religiously delineated, over 1 million people were killed, and countless brutalities, rapes, and so on and so forth. So to give you an overview of this talk, this public talk examines the necropolitics of partition survivors' online accounts by engaging in a study of the 1947 Partition Archive, founded by Gunita Singh Bala and based at the University of California, Berkeley. The digital archive coalesces a crowdsourced community of activists who are collecting the autobiographical tales of a generation of partition witnesses before they pass away. As such, these narrating refugee migrants are doubly tangled in the diasporic necropolitical web. On the one hand, they escape the cross-border genocide of partition wrought by the British Crown's self-interest at the close of World War II, yet on the other hand, they are now subject to death as age creeps forward. That is, ironically, these liminal diasporas, to use a term I coined in 2019, and just a quick aside, the book Liminal Diasporas, will be published next week, and Bidisha's essay is actually the opening essay, so thank you for that. But the notion of liminal diasporas, which is a term that I coined in 2019, have marched from the jaws of empires imposed post-colonial necropolitics into those of mortality biopolitics, wherein both destinations inevitably lead to death. And with reference to what we earlier heard on day one, we could even say that this is also the case for Palestinians in Gaza, although it appears that they would be perpetually oscillating between the jaws of post-colonial necropolitics, in reference to your talk. However, I would propose that the opposite is occurring for liminal diasporas of the partition in the digital milieu with respect to the 1947 Partition archive. And this gesture actually speaks to another paper that we heard earlier that seeks to position resistance and hope at the center of migratory necropolitics. Indeed, the oral recording and digital archiving of these seniors whose bodies, memories, stories are themselves biological archives of Asian trauma is another kind of migration, but into an eternal electronic format. To further explore this contention, I comparatively analyzed the digital narratives of 3 different partition migrants currently living in different places around the globe by utilizing a digital forensics methodology. This methodology, pioneered by Cliff Stoll, who in 1986 utilized computer and network forensics methodologies to track notorious network hacker Marcus Hess in 1986, is the theoretical lens that I'm using with reference to forensics. Stoll, whose investigation made use of computer and network forensic techniques, is recognized as the pioneer of this particular methodology. Given that all humans arrive and depart in the throes of death, partition witnesses in this millennium acquire a modality of digital biopolitics that evokes a kind of cultural reincarnation. So that's basically my overall argument, that in contrast to partition necropolitics, the exposure to death, that the division caused by colonialism, which is something you spoke about in your talk, in contrast to that, the archiving of their particular narratives and stories, and again, this speaks to another theme we talked about yesterday, which is memory and survivor stories as a form of potential agency. I would argue that that mediates against the epistemic violence of partition and empire. To put that another way, I would say that partition witnesses in this millennium acquire a modality of digital biopolitics that invokes a kind of cultural reincarnation. This talk then attempts to seek a less bleak outlook on liminal diasporas doubly exposed to death. In this talk, I would argue that the physical violence initiated by the British Empire's careless exit during partition is potentially avenged in a digital life form that eternally condemns the crown even in post-colonial biological death. I thus engage in a digital ethnographic project that draws on diaspora and post-colonial studies to comparatively track death within death as a kind of new life in the digital milieu. A kind of virtual life that is eternal in its indictment of the British Empire by serving as a material witness to atrocities of the partition caused across the hasty borders rubber stamped by Prime Minister Clement Attlee in February 1947. These narratives that are accessible on the 1947 Partition Archive website demonstrate that even as death from old age approaches, biographies, that is digital archives of survivor stories, can live on and continue to resist contemporary colonialist rhetoric through preservation in the digital milieu. Now, the 2 main conceptual frameworks that I'm drawing on as I'm doing this, and again, these are also frameworks that underpin the new book that I'm working on, are on the one hand the notion of digital forensics, which I'll get into in a second, but the other, which is a theoretical framing that I feel has been threaded throughout everyone's talk that I've heard so far, and that is the notion of necropolitics. So I'd like to just read a little bit from the introduction of the book, which lays out why necropolitics is important, perhaps for all of us, and the future research that we might be doing with respect to migration and digital forensics. So necropolitics is a theory that has been developed by the Cameroonian academic philosopher, political scientist, Joseph Achille Membe, who extends Michel Foucault's notion of biopower, or, and I quote Foucault, a technology of power over the population, a power that I would call the power of regularization, and it, in contrast to sovereignty that took life and let live, consists in making live and letting die, unquote. And extending Foucault's genealogy of the metamorphosis of power from medieval times into the 21st century, Membe vitally describes necropolitics in an eponymous, influential 2003 essay. And this 2003 essay was published, I believe, in Public Culture. And so I quote Membe, "My concern is those figures of sovereignty whose central project is not the struggle for autonomy, but the generalized instrumentalization of human existence and the material destruction of human bodies and populations. Such figures of sovereignty are far from a piece of prodigious insanity or an expression of a rupture between the impulses and interests of the body and those of the mind. Indeed, they, like the death camps, are what constitute the nomos of the political space in which we still live. Becoming subject, therefore, supposes upholding the work of death. Politics is therefore death that lives a human life. Such, too, is the definition of absolute knowledge and sovereignty, risking the entirety of one's life," unquote. Here, Membe sketches out the conditions for necropolitics, which he concludes, and I quote him once more, quote, "that contemporary forms of subjugation of life to the power of death profoundly, and power of death, meaning necropolitics, profoundly reconfigures the relations among resistance, sacrifice, and terror. The notion of biopower," which again is a reference to Michel Foucault, "is insufficient to account for contemporary forms of subjugation of life to the power of death," unquote. Now, in the context of homes, which is something that Mirza talked about a lot in his keynote yesterday, in the context of homes, in the digital milieu, we curiously awaken to the fact that such a sacred space that demarcates the sustenance of life, conversely, in my readings in this project, constellate a macabre ambivalence in relation to queer India, its subjects, and its diasporas. To develop this connection, we must further engage with Membe's life-shattering conceptualization of necropolitics. In citing the work of Bataille, Foucault, Hegel, Karl Marx, Frantz Fanon, Paula Hannah Arendt, Membe concludes his essay with the following earth-shattering words, and I quote Membe, quote, "I have put forward the notion of necropolitics and necropower to account for the various ways in which, in our contemporary world, weapons are deployed in the interest of maximum destruction of persons and the creation of death worlds. New and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to conditions of life, conferring upon them the status of living dead. I have also outlined some of the repressed topographies of cruelty, and this speaks to Alan's paper. Oh, yeah, there you are. The plantation and the colony in particular, and, quote, suggested that under conditions of necropower, the lines between resistance and suicide, sacrifice and redemption, martyrdom and freedom are blurred, unquote. As outlined by Membe, necropolitical exposure to precariously lethal conditions in day-to-day life, what he calls death worlds, is overwhelmingly shaped by the brutal historical facts of white supremacy's power relations as socially articulated through slavery, colonialism, and other social articulations of servitude. As such, and from an intersectional perspective, gender and sexuality are always also present in formulations of necropolitics. The concept has been very influential over at least the past 2 decades, and historically and theoretically consolidates many of the previous concerns espoused by social justice fields, including post-colonial studies, race studies, critical race theory, LGBTQIA+ studies, border studies, migration and diaspora studies, citizenship and legal studies, and refugee studies. Given this wide swath of applications, it seems at first daunting to grip a stable comprehension of the term that empowers one to then apply it throughout social life. In the context of feminist and queer interventions, Christine Keenan and Catherine Thiel define necropolitics in contrast to Foucault's notion of biopolitics. They write, and I quote them, quote, "In this sense, necropolitics questions in today's political climate who gets to live and who must die, or who must live and who is let to die, thereby putting forth a different hypothesis than had Foucault's conceptualization of biopower. While thinking with the Foucauldian theoretical paradigms of analysis, necropolitics is much more concerned with how life is subjugated to the power of death. Thus, rather than showing how life and death are both structuring instruments of power, as if in a relation of equivalence, necropolitics asks about the asymmetrical conditioning of who gets to live and who must die. While Foucault keeps a certain conceptual distance, Membe emphasizes that they are no longer an even pair. Death, making die, is what structures living. Necropolitics thereby uncovers how certain bodies are cultivated for life and reproduction, while others are systematically marked for death, constructing a constantly shifting borderline between subjects deemed productive and lawful, and non-subjects branded as illegitimate or illegal and thus open to death, unquote. So in conclusion, like I said, these are sort of the conceptual frameworks that I'm looking at as I'm examining the digital archives of partition survivors. Clearly, necropolitics is a very important concept for thinking about when empires or power entities in positions of power, including white supremacy, position certain bodies and open and justify their ability to be exposed to death and harm. Again, I would argue that these digital archives and the recording of them in the 1947 Partition archive that's curated by Ganita Bala Singh is one way of mediating against that epistemic violence that has already happened in August 14/7. We can't rewind time and undo the atrocities of the Partition or the Marichjhapi massacre for that matter. But this is all related to another sense of another theoretical lens of digital forensics. And in closing, I just want to read for you what Egan Casey says. This is from the Handbook of Digital Forensics and Investigation. So with respect to this particular framing, Casey writes, and I quote him, "Beyond the basic requirement to collect evidence in a way that preserves its integrity and authenticity, there are a number of practical challenges that investigators can expect when dealing with networks. One of the most significant challenges of investigating criminal activity involving networks is obtaining all the evidence." And again, this echoes some of what you all have said earlier over the past 3 days. "Several factors generally contribute to this challenge. First, the distributed nature of networks results in a distribution of crime scenes, creating practical and jurisdictional problems. For instance, in most cases, it may not even be possible to collect evidence from computers located in China. Even when international or interstate procedures are in place to facilitate digital evidence exchange, the procedures are complex and only practical for serious crimes. Second, because digital data or a network systems are easily deleted or changed, it is necessary to collect and preserve them as quickly as possible. Network traffic exists for only a split second. Information stored in volatile computer memory may exist for only a few hours. Because of their volume, log files may be retained for only a few days. Furthermore, if they have the skill and the opportunity, criminals will destroy or modify evidence to protect themselves." And you might be wondering, why am I drawing on this? Well, because I believe the partition of what was called British India is a crime. What's happening in Gaza is a crime. That is criminal, even though it's state sanctioned. And this is why it's really important to draw on Membe's notion of necropolitics, wherein certain bodies that are racialized or marked by religion or where they're positioned in the global south are open and legally exposed to death. A third contributing factor is the wide range of technical expertise that is required when networks are involved in a crime, because every network is different, combining different technologies in unique ways. no single individual is equipped to deal with every situation. Therefore, it is often necessary to find individuals who are familiar with a given technology before evidence can be collected. A fourth contributing factor is the great volume of data that are often involved in an investigation involving computer systems. Searching for useful evidence in vast amounts of digital data can be like finding a needle in a haystack. In the ideal case, when most of the digital evidence is available to investigators, another significant challenge arises when it is necessary to associate an individual with specific activity on a computer or network. Even when offenders make no effort to conceal their identity, they can claim that they were not responsible. Given the minor amount of effort required to conceal one's identity on the internet, criminals usually take some action to thwart apprehension. This concealment behavior may be as simple as using a library computer. Additionally, there are many services that provide varying degrees of anonymity on the internet, making the task even harder. Encryption presents the ultimate challenge, making it difficult or impossible for investigators to analyze evidence that has already been found, collected, documented, and preserved. And so this methodology, therefore, provides for investigating criminal activities on networks, delving into common sources of evidence on networks, and the practical use in an investigation. So I'll just stop there because I think that that's a lot for us to chew on for now. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Rahul. Up to you. Thank you, Rahul. Our final speaker today is Karim Danoun. So Karim is Associate Professor in Contemporary American Literature at University Paul Valéry, Montpellier. His research centers on contemporary American literature, which includes Arab American and Arab Canadian writing. So he has written on a number of American and Canadian writers. His work is concerned with the intersection between poetics, politics, and ethics. And lately he has been focusing his attention on the notion of listening in or listening to literature. He's a member of the editorial board of the online journal Transatlantica, and a publication, which is a publication of the French Association for American Studies. Welcome, Karim. And Karim's paper this morning is titled "Destiny Has Been Derailed: War and Massacre in Et al. Adnan's The Arab Apocalypse."
Is this working? Yeah. So I'm going to try to to handle 3 devices at the same time. So I hope I can do this properly. Thank you, Bidisha. Thank you, Thomas and Judith, for this wonderful conference. I'm really happy to be amongst you today. Speak up. Sorry. That's better. It worked. I tried. No, it doesn't. It did? No, it doesn't. Should I sit closer to the? If I don't mind if it's. I don't think it's a question of distance, is it? It worked when yeah, now it's working, okay. So the title is "Destiny Has Been Derailed." Oh, I'm sorry. I just brought the book I'm talking about. The French version is the small one, and the American version, translated by the writer, is the orange one. Because it's a very strange book, okay? It's a very cryptic book. So, Destiny Has Been Derailed: Witnessing War and Massacre in Et al. Adnan's The Arab Apocalypse. So I'll start with 3 epigraphs. Meanwhile, Beirut moans and burns, but not a single voice is to be heard on behalf of torn muscles, blinded eyes, cigarette-burned faces, vertebrae broken with an axe. It is as if Beirut has become an anatomy treatise that one reads in some dark corner of hell. Roland Barthes, for writing to be manifest in its truth and not in its instrumentality, it must be illegible. And Adnan again, how can I avoid the writing about the Lebanese civil war when I lived it? And these are basically the outline of my talk. So the Lebanese American poet and painter Etel Adnan, which you can see here, wrote her ghastly book-length poem, The Arab Apocalypse, between January 1975 and the summer of 1976. In it, she addresses the civil war in Lebanon, and more specifically, the siege by the Lebanese forces of the Palestinian refugee camp Tel el-Zatar in Beirut from January 5th to August 12, 1976. Originally published in French in 1980 and translated by Adnan herself in 1989, the poem is composed of 59 sections which correspond to the 59-day siege of the camp. So everything that's yellow on screen is me highlighting. It's not part of the book. The book is in black and white. The living had slept 59 days with the corpses, 59 days, 59 days. The siege culminated in what historian Rashid Khalidi called what was probably the largest single massacre during the entire war, the civil war. It was perpetrated by the right-wing Christian militias of the Kateb party, also known as the Phalanges, with Israel's covert support. About the casualty and victims, I'd like to quote David Hurst, as a journalist. Tel el-Zatar held out for 53 days in appalling conditions of hunger and thirst, untreated wounds, continuous shelling, and tank fire at almost point-blank range. 3,500 died, between 1,000 and 2,000 after the camp had fallen, crushed by bulldozers, shot and hacked to death, or finished by militiamen, or just ordinary folk, on whom they chanced in their desperate flight to the safety of Muslim West Beirut, end quote. Now, where Adnan says 59 days, journalist David Hurst says 53. This discrepancy should serve as a reminder that the poet and the journalist or the historian do not treat the event in the same way. And I'm quoting Caroline Forchet, a poem that calls on us from the other side of a situation of extremity cannot be judged by simplistic notions of accuracy or truth to life. It will have to be judged, as Ludwig Wittgenstein said of Confessions, by its consequences, not by our ability to verify its truth. In fact, the poem might be our only evidence that an event has occurred. It exists for us as the sole trace of an occurrence. As such, there will be nothing for us to base the poem on, no independent account that would tell us whether or not we can see a given text as being objectively true, end of quote. And this is where literature moves away from forensics, from the evidentiary, or paradoxically, this is precisely when literature becomes a form of counter-forensics in its own way by being the recipient of traces. If the architecture of the poem is imposed by the siege of Tel Zatar, to reduce it to the latter only would not do justice to the intricacies of the poem, which is also about the ambiguous and ubiquitous figure of the sun, the protagonist in a way that renders the cataclysmic intensity and consequences with which the crimes have been perpetrated. Most critics have argued that the sun represent, and this is a quote, colonial, neo-colonial, and imperialist powers and their effect on subjugated peoples, end of quote. Thus understood, the sun is French, British, Israeli, American. Yet, it is all too clear that the sun is much more ambiguous. The very first line do point to a multiplicity of perspectives to describe the sun that shines differently in the eyes of the looker, a proof that when the poem starts, the speaking eye is both one and more than one. So this is the opening of the poem. As you can see on the slide, the perception of the universal sun is appropriated through the singularization effected by color, just as so the sun is yellow, the sun is red, and so on and so forth, affected by color, just as the boats repeat themselves through variations. You can see the boats highlighted in yellow, So we recognize pseudo boats, and they're also very different when you look at all of them. Thus understood, the sun embodies also Lebanese sectarianism. Hence, an Arab mosaic that composes Lebanon as a whole and the Arab world beyond that. That's why the sun is Arab, as you can all see in the following quotes, short quotes from the text. In that sense, the poem is thus overtly about the Arab world. The massacre and the beginning of this internecine war manifest therefore what Adnan believed would happen to all Arabs. Here is how Adnan explained her feeling. From the balcony of my apartment on the 10th floor in Ashrafih, in eastern Beirut, I could see bombs falling on Tel Zatar refugee camp. In the distance, little houses under the bombs could be seen, and I knew there were people in it, besieged. I was devastated on a human and political level. I could see the double catastrophe. I could see the end of Lebanon, but also the end of the Arab world. Writing this book took me several months, so it's a poem about the apocalypse, the destruction, the self-destruction of the Arab world, end of quote. The poem is very cryptic in its form as it combines poetic writing with visual art. Even the center narrative around the siege of Tel Zatar is fragmentary and failed to cohere into a whole precisely because war brings about a chaotic world. Amidst the cosmic dimension of the catastrophes involving the sun in almost every single page, an anonymous speaker, an I, navigates the poem and serves as witness. But the I is, according to Hilary Plum, more than simply a witness. It is a victim and it is an executioner. So I would like to posit that the symbolism at stake in the poem, which accounts for a total war, and the versatility of the I, the speaking I, which oscillates between complementary, albeit contradictory positions with idiosyncratic gazes, may provide an aesthetic counter-forensic. I argue that Adnan's poem grants her language a conspicuous fallibility with regards to truth, and conversely, in a paradoxical manner, she endows, in doing so, writing and literature, a form of counter-forensic aesthetics enmeshed in forms of truth and materiality. So I propose to analyze first how death is represented, and I will then pay close attention to the language used by Adnan to show that the way it records and testifies to those deaths and atrocities are in a way unforensic, by which I mean that they circumvent a form of truth since her language bears the traces of the extreme conditions it reports. And following this, I will attempt to explain why the unstable speaking I summons all the witnesses of the poems, Adnan included, but do not coalesce in one monad, as the latter would perpetuate what is at the origin of death and massacre, and along with it, the complete destruction of the world in the form of an apocalypse. So, So I begin with really the graphic description of death. So although the poem is has a universal scope, thanks to the cosmic scope, perhaps I should say, thanks to the reference to the stars, the sun, the moon, and so on, the Arab world is at the heart of the poem, and at the heart of that heart, if I may say, is the vulnerability of the Palestinian people and their homelessness. I can't see much, yes. So I'm quoting, Palestinians with no Palestine. As the siege prevents the refugee camp to shelter the refugees with no refuge, only death offers respite. There is a refuge only in death. There is no refuge but in fire. Death is omnipresent. Women, children, men, everything is dead. And it functions according to its own rationale to beget more death. Quote, in death, 1 + 1 makes 3. Death roams at every corner of the camp and has become a sort of inverted gauge to measure life. Active death, livelier than life. And like a plague, it spreads to convert life into death. Quote, when the living rot on the bodies of the dead, end quote. So death as superseded life in the poem, as superseded life itself, reversing the very meaning of words. It has, for instance, altered the distinction between being injured and dead to increase the amount of suffering. Quote, a dead man forced to go home on foot, a bullet in the belly. Each wounded is the dead man, or one wounded man in a hole in his forehead. This apocalyptic vision culminates in a war that is raging where the warring actors are dead. There has been battle between carrions and corpses. So Adnan does not flinch in the face of graphic atrocity as she enumerates the acts of barbarity committed in the camp. Scenes evoking dead bodies are many, just as those displaying dismembered bodies. You can see them scattered organs. The sun can cut their toes and so on and so forth. But also decomposing bodies, like a dead person laid in the funeral bed, head looking like a rotten orange, a dead son rotten and eaten by worms. And there are, and the last one is on corpses. And of course, these are just few verses, but there are a lot in the book. It's literally everywhere. And I could have added other categories like blood, slaughter, you name it. So I've shown very briefly how Adnan depicts the camp as a living hell inhabited by dead bodies and fragmented corpses. And I am now going to examine some elements, both poetic and visual, pertaining to the language used by the poet. So in the face of such massive death, you have probably noticed how the language of fabulation, and Caroline Fourchet calls the fabulations the writing of the blatantly fictitious, or even surrealist images supersede the everyday and the factual. And I'm quoting Fourchet, witnessed in this light is problematic. Even if one has witnessed atrocity, one cannot necessarily speak about it, let alone for it, end of quote. But there are other elements in the language. And I begin with the fragmentary telegraphic style of the poems. Or the poem, I should say. The poem is made of autonomous sentences as if each of them were designed to record a scene without relating it to another, as if the syntax were being violently severed from within. Oh, I'm lost. Yeah, that's the last quote. Adnan explained how each sentence in this book, like in Arabic poetry, is a full statement. Each sentence stands on its own compared to the next. Each long verse is self-sufficient. I didn't do it on purpose. There's no logic, but accumulation, expansion, and rupture, end of quote. In that sense, the succession of sentences recalls the telegraphic style of war communication, a formal design emphasized by Adnan's use of capitalized words, especially the most iterated one, the word stop. The effect is that experience is delivered with dispatch, as if a sense of impending emergency was at stake. The emergency elicited by the preserving task of consecutive acts of witnessing in the midst of the dead and of the war, but also in the face of the teleology of the apocalypse. Yet the word stop fails to bring the sentence to an end, inferring that the war message seems incapable of coping with the fatal pace of war. Writing is too slow, death is too fast. Note here also that the telegraphic messaging is precisely devised to, this is the OED definition, omitting inessential words and be concise, hence to communicate faster. Adnan wishes to counter a war by vehemently calling it to stop. This is the quote from the bottom slide. The quote at the bottom of the slide. Stop works. I was scared a fighter arrived perched on a tank. Stop. Saluting. In the last example, stop works in both directions to terminate the war by calling both on the tank and the military salute to stop. Another aspect that betrays the inadequacy of language transpires in the way Adnan's poetic syntax leads to a form of stuttering. The juxtaposition of unpunctuated verbal or nominal clauses hinders legibility and sometimes intelligibility. The syntax thus signals its own laboriousness in its attempt to come to terms with the horrendous spectacles it strives to depict. And what characterizes this stuttering syntax is verbatim repetition or juxtaposition, and sometimes pseudo-tautologies that indicate impaired or dead language. So you have a couple of them highlighted here. Oh, so far, okay. So the most blatant aspect of the disturbance that occurs within language are little drawings that are part and parcel of the syntax. Adnan explained, in the Arab apocalypse, the signs are my excess of emotions. I cannot say more. I wrote by hand, and here and there I put a word I made instinctively, a little drawing, a sign. I kept those signs for the printed book. I did not add them. They came during the writing. They're part of it. So I'm just gonna, I'm a little late, I'm running late, so I'm just gonna skip a little. So you can see some of them here. So the signs are there alternately to signify an impossibility to signify or to embody a visual language that would probably fail without the support of its linguistic counterpart. Yet as the signs are fully integral to the syntax as in an asemic writing, and this is a quote by Schwenger, the result is a kind of cognitive dissonance. Writing is evoked at the same time that we are estranged from it. End of quote. What is inscribed on the pages turn into traces with the potential to restore elements that are obliterated in the technology of the alphabet. So I have scrutinized Adnan's language to contend that the disaster of the world epitomized by the massacre is disseminated into the language to signal, in the words of Mikado, an apocalypse of language. And I want to discuss the versatile position of the speaking I. So the poem is filled with sentences beginning with I, or that include me. The most conspicuous feature of these first-person pronouns is that they remain unidentified. They do not cohere into a single subjective identity. On the contrary, their identities keep shifting to occupy concurrent and rival positions in the poem. For instance, the speaking I sometimes embody the perpetrator. Sometimes it may embody the victim, or sometimes it embodies a witness. Yet, what is striking is the fact that a multiplicity of persona shares the same pronoun, but the latter is never fully embraced. For Mikado, the critic Mikado, this plural I provides a testimony of some sort. She says, Adnan's record, if we can call it that, of the Arab apocalypse is not that of a survivor who remembers or a journalist who is apart from the violence, but one who is actively there, seeing, suffering, and even perpetrating. It is thus also a record of something acknowledged to be endless by the calendar of human history, which we can only make sense when we arrive at some sort of cosmic finality of time, end of quote. This flexibility in subject positions may testify to Adnan's instable position both inside and outside what she writes. She cannot dwell fully in the well-circumscribed speaking I that the war demands that she choose, because otherwise she would simply perpetuate the sectarianism and therefore the colonial violence that instigated the war in the first place. And I'm just going to conclude. In the Arab apocalypse, the death of the refugees and other Arabs is registered and materialized on the page by a language that enacts the composability of factuality, fabulation, and fragmentation. The pages formally bear the traces of what has been experienced by Etel Adnan when she predicted very early on the scope of a conflict that was just beginning and that would last 15 years. It is the extent of the violence she witnessed that dramatized her view of the inexorability of a total destruction. The Arab apocalypse remains a dark book where death and the remains of the dead are absorbed in a sort of planetary annihilation, the disaster, that is to say, the very negation of the star that the sun is. And this is the last page of the poem. I'm sorry. which ends, in the night, we shall find knowledge, love, and peace. Only then in the night, peace and life can emerge or be revealed as the apocalypse has it. Apocalypse means revelation. This is done away from light, where witnessing is impossible because it has stopped existing, because violence and death have stopped being perpetrated. Thank you.
Thanks, Karim. We have some time for questions. So. Yeah.
Thank you all for this fascinating panel. I really enjoyed the 3 talks. I have a question for Rahul. When you know, the conceptual frame of your work between Foucault and Membe, I was wondering if there is room in between for Edward Said and Judith Butler. So, because that's one question. And for Karim, when you talk, I was wondering if she expected this repetition, and she, you know, I would argue that her work is eternal, because this situation keeps on repeating itself. And sometimes when the artist paints, he paints what he cannot verbalize, and she used the sign of what she couldn't verbalize, if you see it this way. Thank you both.
Yes, that's exactly that. Adnan felt that something huge was beginning, and there is an interview where she speaks about this taxi driver in Beirut, who I don't remember if she was in the taxi or if a friend told her that, a taxi in Beirut who willingly ran over a cat, and the passenger said, "How can you do that?" And the taxi driver was mad at the person, and Adnan says that this is the moment where you feel that that a city is ready for the worst. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. There is definitely room for Edward Said and Judith Butler. But I would say, you know, in the longer version of the introduction to this new book, I'm actually also drawing on the work of Anne McClintock, who in her book Imperial Leather, she really beautifully ties together the work of Said and Judith Butler. So I'm drawing more on that, but I'm also drawing on a lot of work in the digital humanities, and what in the past few years has emerged is QDH, which is queer digital humanities. So that's sort of the direction I've been going in. There's no neat way to, I mean, what I'm finding as I'm working on this project is it's got to be an intersection of multiple different lenses, because there's really no one lens to think about the kinds of stuff that I've been interested in the past couple of years. So thank you for the question.
Thank you both. I have a question about you, since you mentioned like to use multiple lenses, and I don't know if you remember in my presentation, I proposed to reverse the necropolitical paradigm and see the policies that are founded on that instead of the policies that produces death. I'm wondering if you also have questioning about how actually the death is not only the end, because sometimes in the literary form, the death is used as a metaphor for something that is, as you said, liminal, the end, dark, it's the end of everything. While and on the anthropological perspective, the death body is very much productive, and sometimes this metaphor, because as you mentioned, like there's the production, the enormous theoretical production given by Achille Membe, and the enormous use of his work among many scholarly fields. And I really appreciate how you delved into Membe's word instead of using necropolitics as normally is used. Like everyone knows, like there's use this term, but actually this term means something very specific. It's not just politics and death. It's far more. And also this far more is also maybe how people use death as not only the end of something, but as beginning of something else, like digital biopolitics, as you were saying. Last point, can you specify the differences between the necropolitics, how you frame necropolitics and in opposition with the idea of biopolitics, which is not in opposition, but you mentioned like there's a continuity, like the differences between necropolitics and biopolitics, and why you use digital biopolitics and not digital necropolitics or other terms. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Georgia. Right, so I think just to go to the title, because I thought about this a lot, why I had to sit down and think about it really carefully. Like, why am I saying partition necropolitics as opposed to digital biopolitics? And the reason I switched them around, because one might think, well, why are you talking about digital biopolitics if the person whose digital narrative is already dead? But what I was trying to do was exactly what you were sort of gesturing towards, is think about a new kind of life in and through death, because the language of necropolitics and the notion of death, in some ways, and I'm thinking about the conversation we had yesterday, in some senses, it robs one of agency even in death. So I was just trying to think about it in that way. And that's why I talk about partition necropolitics, because it's actually the opening up to death, that partition as a historical moment, but even as an epistemic violence of empire that has galvanized, that leads to the archiving of these digital narratives that, these folks that have been interviewed by Bala Singh and the oral historians that have traveled around the world and interviewed these people and recorded their narratives before they died, actually leads to what I call in the title digital biopolitics. So it's almost like a rebirth or a mediation against the violence of empire of the moment of partition, which was August 5th, 1947, in archiving and recording their stories. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but that's what's really important to me. And overall, in a wider view, the reason that, and again, the title of the book has changed so often, but the reason I call it digital necropolitics is, in all the other chapters, I'm looking at the ways in which the digital milieu is an ambivalent space, because on the one hand, it's sort of this, the internet, it's so liberatory, it connects us all, and during COVID, we weren't allowed to see each other, but oh my gosh, we have Zoom and we have Teams and we can connect online. But it's that same technology that connects us that opens people up to some of the most insidious violence you can imagine. One of my chapters is on the suicide of the gay teen Tyler Clementi, who his roommate, Darun Ravi, they were both students at Rutgers University. This is about 10 years ago, and he was a closeted young gay man, and his roommate, Darun Ravi, basically found out that he was going to be having like gay sex with this man, and he opened up his computer and he set it to record the whole thing and positioned it towards his roommate's bed. And his roommate, and he broadcast it and then sent a note to all the students at Rutgers University. And when his roommate found out about it, he actually walked to the George Washington Bridge in New York City and he jumped off of it, committed suicide. So that's one example where the so-called liberatory and democratic contours of digitality actually opens people up to some of the most heinous kinds of violence, especially with respect to, in my view, or what I'm arguing, gender and sexuality. So there's, the switching around of the notion of necropolitics and biopolitics, even in death, as a form of trying to reclaim some sort of agency, to go back to the conversation we were having yesterday, in death. But at the same time, even in life, when we look at the digital milieu, there's some really violent forms of exposing people to death and destruction, and in my reading, in and through gendered sexuality, or so-called transgressive gendered sexuality.
Well, thank you. I've got a question for both panelists. Really excellent papers. And firstly, for Karim, asked both questions. Yeah, I am doing my best. Sorry, it's early morning. First to Karim, I think it's really important that your work is talking about the inadequacy of language to deal with genocide and trauma. And what I'd say to an extent is some of the people who are most adept in the world of culture in kind of talking to this do not rely just on words. So they're in the era of language, but also art, and using multiplicity as a means of doing this. And I feel that multiplicity might be the only way we can deal with this. And so I suppose Emnor Basie Thilip would be someone who in her poem Song is attempting to use language and silence as means to do this. So I'd just like you to think about that and think about how this poetry attends to that. And then for Rahul, I love your multiplicity of theoretical modes and your intersectionality. I note that you didn't say class, and I'm interested in why not, or why not the underclass. And then I think you didn't mention, although I'm sure you use him, is Giorgio Agamben, who I think in his terms of talking about the half-life has taken us in places which are better. And then finally, what is the problematics of this theoretical mode, or this multiple theoretical mode, in terms of, I think it sometimes sounds to me a bit like Afro-pessimism, which to me is a dead end in terms of politics. And I worry about that. Thank you.
What can I say? I agree with you with this idea that that it should be, or that it should be tackled in multiple ways within a very singular piece of art. Maybe I'll say this, considering the fact that this book was written in French. Adnan wrote a very tiny essay on her relationship with languages, and the fact that when she was young, living in Beirut, she was born in Beirut, she was not allowed to speak Arabic. And so there's this whole theory that when she went to the US quite early in the 50s, she felt liberated. And but it was not sufficient in a way, and this is when she started painting. So there is a sense in this long poem that those images, those glyphs, are in a way her Arabic language, because she could not write it. She could speak it with her father. Her father was an Ottoman general, and her mother spoke Turkish, and she went to school and was forced to speak French. So perhaps there is this linguistic element that comes into it as well.
Okay, so firstly, yes, 200%. what I read is part of like a 35. And my editor's already annoyed at me because it's too long for an introduction. But I definitely talk about Agamben's notion of bare life. And I start the opening paragraph of the introduction to this book is on class and caste. And it then moves into gender and sexuality, because indeed, gender and sexuality is also a particular way of thinking about class. That is to say, gender, whereas class or caste might be, we think of it predominantly in terms of finance, gender and sexuality is also a class of people based on biology. And so that's why I didn't mean to skip over that. And finally, I would love to pick your brain over coffee on the problematics of this, the possible problematics of this, what I've read, because in one sense, it's a bit idealistic and romantic, but in the other sense, I just think it's such a shit world we're in right now that I don't know how else to read things. So thanks. And really quickly, before we go to coffee, I just want to remind everyone that we have a hashtag for the conference. It's hashtag Thematic Ethics, capital T and capital E. And just if you do make posts or put pictures up, if you could just use that hashtag, it'll, at the end of this, aggregate all of us through a digital repository. So thanks.
All right, we're going to close this panel here because we're running late. So thank you, everyone. Please join me in thanking our three speakers today, Rahul, Angshuman, and Karim. And we'll be back. When do you, no, I think less, because we're supposed to have started now. Yeah, so 15 minutes, yeah. Thank you, thanks.